Hello everyone, welcome to this new video of integration series. In this video, we are going to learn about two very important terms in integration, authentication and authorization. So let's get started. So authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user or system attempting to access ServiceNow or any system in general. So you must have seen Instagram and you must have tried to log in into it or any other application like Facebook or Google. So at the start, it asks you for a username and password or for an email or for password. So that is basically authentication that is asked to you to verify your identity, whether you are a valid user or not. So that is authentication. The user provides credentials, their username and password or some other mechanisms. And the system uses those credentials to check if you are a valid user or not. Do you have access to enter that system or not? ServiceNow validates the credentials to confirm the user is who they claim to be. Once authenticated, the user is allowed to access the instance, right? Similarly, in ServiceNow as well, you have a username and password section where you enter your details. And if you are a valid user, you do have access to enter ServiceNow. ServiceNow instance will provide you access once your credentials are validated, right? So that is basically authentication. Now there are multiple methods to implement and to achieve authentication in ServiceNow. Those are local login, like using username and password. Then we have LDAP authentication, in which we use as an external directory service, example Active Directory, where all the data of the users are stored. So LDAP is a method. Then we have single sign-on using SAML or OAuth. Then we have multi-factor authentication, which adds an extra layer, a code from a mobile device that basically adds an extra layer of authentication, an extra layer of security. Then we have certificate based authentication, right? So this is basically authentication, verifying the identity of a user. Coming to our next thing, authorization. Now, once the authentication is done, the authorization process starts. So authorization determines what actions a user is allowed to perform after they are authenticated. So once you are allowed to enter the system, what actions you can perform in that system, what all tables you can view, what all fields you can view, what all APIs you can access, and different records what you can see. So those things, the permissions, basically are controlled using authorization, right? So once a user is authenticated, their roles, access controls, and permissions determine what they can see and what they can do in the instance. So authorization rules are enforced in ServiceNow for tables and records, for different fields in those tables, for UI elements like front-end elements, and the different APIs that we have, right? And key authorization tools that are used in ServiceNow. So using roles, like through roles, we can assign some specific role like admin or ITL or approver role, or you can also create your any custom role that you can provide to the user based on your specific requirement. And based on those roles, the user is either allowed or not allowed to do some task in the instance, right? Then we have access control list or ACLs. If you have not, if you're not familiar with what ACLs are, you can see our video on ACL in our channel. So ACLs basically controls access at the table, record, or at field levels. So you can write different ACLs according to your need. Then we have UI policies and data policies. So that basically affect the visibility or editability based on some conditions, right? Then we have script includes. We can also use script includes or business rules. So these are basically server side scripts. So let's take a use case where you have a very complex condition around which you want to implement authorization, whether you want to provide access to the user or you don't want to allow access to the user. That is a very complex logic. So you can use scripting. In script includes, you can write some custom scripts inside it, where using which you can enforce custom logic around access. Okay, so this is basically authorization, and these are the ways in which authorization is implemented in ServiceNow. Now let's see a comparison between both these terms, authentication and authorization. So first thing is what it does. So authentication basically verifies your identity, while authorization controls access and permissions. The authentication basically answers to who are you, who actually you are. Are you allowed to enter the system? While authorization tells you what are you allowed to do. Once you give this answer, then who are you? After that, what are you allowed to do in that system? That is basically answered by authorization. When it happens, so authentication happens at the start, first at login, while authorization happens after login during your usage of the instance. The tools that we use in authentication are basically passwords or SSO or LDAP, while authorization we use roles, ACLs, UI policies, and things like that. Let's take an example. So user logs in with SSO in ServiceNow system. So that is basically authenticating, while user with ITL role can access incidents. So let's say if I have an ITL role, then only I can access the incident table. Otherwise, I'll not be allowed to access that incident table. So this is basically authorization. I hope you have understood the concept between both these terms now. Let's move on to our next topic, REST API authentication. So till now we looked at what is authentication in general. Now we'll specifically look into what is authentication in REST APIs. So authentication in REST APIs is the process of verifying who is making a request to the API. So let's say I have created an inbound REST API and I'm providing that endpoint to some third party application. Now, if I do not implement authentication in that API, anyone with the endpoint can access that API, right? But most of the cases, we don't allow any third party to access that application. We only want a specific third party to access that API, right? Because our incident data or our any ServiceNow data is very confidential thing, right? So we cannot allow any third party to access those data. So to implement this thing, we use REST API authentication, right? So that we provide a username and password or any other mechanism that we can use, that we'll learn later in our video in our integration playlist. So using those credentials, we provide that credentials to that specific third party, to which we want, to whom we are allowing the to use our API, right? And in every request that the third party is creating a request. So in every request, those credentials will be there, right? So since REST API are usually stateless, now the stateless means every request is independent of other request, right? Every request is independent of other. There is no session memory between request unless you use token or session based mechanism. But in those as well, you in every request you have to include some form of authentication credentials. So if you are using a basic auth, or in simple terms a username or password based authentication, then you have to send those credential details in every request you are sending. That means in every request you must have some information about the username and password. While if you're using a token based mechanism, in that scenario as well, you must have some token information in every request you are sending. Okay, so this is the term stateless means. Now, ServiceNow supports several standard authentication mechanism for REST APIs. There are two: basic authentication, which is implemented using username and password. Then there is OAuth 2.0 that is implemented using tokens. Now, let's see each one of them one by one. So, basic authentication is you send a username and password in the HTTP header of the request, encoded in base 64. So, the username and password is a very confidential thing. You cannot allow everyone to see it. That is why we encode it in base 64. So if you see the request example here, so authorization basic, then you can see a string, right? YWRT. So this is basically the encoded string which contains the data for username and password. And then we have our endpoint. So this string is basically contain information about username and password, and when the request is sent, this string is decoded by the API, right? And then converted into username and password again, and authentication is implemented. Okay, so this way you implement basic authentication in ServiceNow or in any system. Basic auth is not secure unless used over HTTPS protocol. Okay, avoid using it in production unless necessary. So you see this base 64 encoded string here, right? So this is a very low level security, because this thing can be easily decoded by any hackers or anyone, right? So this is not a very ideal way of authentication, right? This is not very secure way. So you should generally avoid using basic auth unless it is very necessary for your use case, right? So this is how basic auth is implemented. We will look into OAuth 2.0 in our coming videos. I hope the concept of authentication, authorization, and basic auth is good to you. That is all for this video. Thank you.